We are back. Sam Seder on the Majority Report on the phone. It's a pleasure to welcome back to the program the Director of Public Citizens Global Trade Watch, Lori Wallach. Lori, welcome back to the program.
Thank you very much.
So yesterday, it was announced, and I think I don't know if we haven't had quite obviously it has to go to the Senate, but and I don't know that they actually had the vote yesterday in the House, but it appears at the very least they have the votes to pass the USMCA. This is the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. It's NAFTA 2.0, I guess. Maybe some would argue 1.2 or something like that. But that's why I wanted you here, Lori. Go through, just tell us a little bit of the background of what this supposed new NAFTA is. There's a lot of questions around this, not the least of which is, was it worth it doing this from a political standpoint? But let's first just look at the trade agreement itself.
So what happened yesterday was the Democrats announced that after a year of fighting to improve a really bad NAFTA renegotiation Trump signed in 2018, they had forced changes to the deal, and the administration had agreed and Mexico and Canada had agreed. So there hasn't been a vote yet. The backstory of this is that after 25 years, NAFTA had proved to be the disaster that a lot of congressional Democrats and unions and consumer and environmental groups had predicted in the first instance. Over 1 million U.S. jobs are government certified as lost to NAFTA. $400 million had been paid out in investor state corporate attacks on North American environmental and health laws in front of tribunals of 3 trade officials. And the damage was ongoing. Every week, companies were outsourcing jobs to Mexico to pay workers less. Wages in Mexico are now lower than when NAFTA started and 40% lower than Chinese manufacturing wages. So the NAFTA was a mess and an ongoing mess with new damage happening every week. So the mission was, could changes be made to ameliorate that damage? And the deal that Trump renegotiated and declared was wonderful and gave a new name, he called it the USMCA, as you said, did that at the end of last year. That agreement actually was worse than the original NAFTA, in that Trump let pharma rig it and add new monopoly protections that would have locked in high medicine prices here, handcuffing Congress from changing the existing laws that have given us the highest medicine prices in the world, and then exporting those bad policies to raise prices in Mexico and Canada. So Democrats said, hey, your new NAFTA locks in high medicine prices and doesn't fix the original sin of NAFTA outsourcing. Forget about it. You got to renegotiate your renegotiated deal, or we're not interested. And then a year of fighting started. And yesterday, Trump agreed to a bunch of the Democrats' demands.
Let's talk about what those demands were. I mean, I know that at the very least, my understanding is that the investor dispute settlement, ISDS, you'll have to help me on this, but the mechanism in which essentially disputes are settled, that element seems to have been taken out. Is that correct?
So yes. So to give a little background for your listeners, folks who remember when you guys were talking about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, and helping people understand what that was. This is those corporate tribunals at the heart of TPP. They came out of NAFTA. That was the model. And this is where multinational corporations can demand unlimited compensation from taxpayers by going to tribunals of 3 corporate attorneys who can decide if the investors' special rights and privileges given in the agreement were undermined by domestic environmental or health or safety law. And under NAFTA, $400 million has been paid out by taxpayers to multinational corporations in successful attacks on energy regulations, water use policies, timber policies, toxic ban, outrageous. So the new NAFTA.
And let me just add one more aspect of that. My understanding, too, that is also problematic is that it's cost taxpayers in that because we've had to pay for profits that corporations would have anticipated getting were it not for laws that we made to protect the environment, to protect consumers, to protect workers, or whatever it was. But also, I imagine we have instances where municipalities, where counties, where states, or the country at large made decisions not to pass certain protections because of a fear of running afoul of that.
Precisely right. And also, in some instances, existing protections were eliminated to avoid the next case after the first payout happened. So, for instance, Canada got rid of a ban on a toxic gasoline additive we ban here after the Ethyl Corporation, the folks who put lead in our gasoline, won an ISDS NAFTA case, and part of the settlement was reversing that ban. So you're spot on. It's a very bad thing. So what happened, what from my perspective, the single best thing in the new NAFTA is investor-state dispute settlement was altogether eliminated between the U.S. and Canada. That's a big deal because most of the environmental ISDS NAFTA attacks have been U.S. corporations attacking Canada. And, in fact, all of them but two have been that. And the elimination of ISDS between the U.S. and Canada also means 93%, almost all U.S. ISDS exposure is gone because of all the foreign investors in the U.S., only mainly the Canadian ones had ISDS rights. There are a handful of companies from other countries where we have free trade agreements that have ISDS, but mainly it was Canadian companies. So that is a huge improvement. Then with respect to Mexico,
and we should also say, we should also say that the benefit of this is that maybe it provides a precedent for future trade deals saying, we didn't have it here, we don't need it there.
Well, what I'm about to say is that with respect to Mexico, so people will say, okay, between two developed countries with strong court systems, I guess maybe whatever. But this is the thing that is truly precedent setting. With respect to Mexico, a country that doesn't have a strong rule of law, the new agreement whacks the old ISDS system, and it only allows compensation through a reformed process where, for instance, the tribunalist can't be both serving as a lawyer suing a government and serving as a judge. You have to pick a side. Or where the damages aren't based on the speculative future expected profits, which, as you pointed out, is what the current system is, but rather you have to prove actual damages. But also, the only thing you can get compensation for is if the government actually expropriates your property, takes it physically. A definition is physical seizure or total control of title. And for direct acts of discrimination against a foreign investor after your investment's been set up. That is compared to the current NAFTA, which creates this broad right for a foreign company to invest, right to control natural resources, right to not be regulated. All that stuff got whacked. So for the world to see here in the belly of the beast, the country that had pushed ISDS, that expanded it. We are the country that expanded ISDS and the TPP to even more broader rights. Here we are getting rid of it altogether for developing countries. And with respect to with developed countries, and with respect to a developing country partner, basically narrowing it down to compensation for direct expropriation in a much more fair system. Okay. That is a huge signal to the whole world that even here, we see the ISDS system as illegitimate. And that's super helpful because a lot of developing countries started with South Africa, Brazil was out there already, but Ecuador, Bolivia, Indonesia, other countries have said, we're out of this system. This thing is ridiculous. And now the U.S. basically sending the signal lets a lot of other smaller developing countries join the bandwagon and try and exit this dangerous system. So that's the best thing in the New Deal. But even though the Democrats were able to get all that new bad pharma stuff out, and that's definitely worth noting, because typically U.S. trade agreements just keep giving the pharmaceutical companies more and more protections. that was just taking out a new bad thing. You know, that's like classic Trump, right? He creates a crisis and then he tries to get credit for fixing it. So that was like, you know, that was a bag of crap he put into it, and then, you know, okay, I'll take my bag of crap back out. But that was just an additional problem to the original NAFTA. The real open standing question is, are the improved labor and environmental standards that, you know, the original ones that Trump signed in his deal in 2018 were a mess. The Democrats made improvements for sure. But are those improvements, it is the improved enforcement, going to actually prove to be enough to reverse some of the outrageous wage suppression in Mexico? Now, when Trump says this is going to bring back hundreds of thousands of jobs, that's 100% baloney, garbage, absurd. That's not happening. That's not what this deal is. This is not a transformational people and planet first, this is for the workers deal. The question is, can these improvements actually create real unions in Mexico so people can fight for real wages, and the result will be less draw to outsource jobs because folks in Mexico get paid more? That's the real story of what we have to watch to see if this deal does.
Okay. So we have the IMF saying that the most we can imagine is about 50,000 jobs tops created in the U.S. The question is do these reforms in terms of protections for labor in Mexico, do they have enough teeth? Will they be enforced in such a way that over time it will gradually increase the protections of and the wages of Mexican workers, which will then stabilize, you know, that sort of giant sucking sound that Ross Perot had talked about, I guess, 30 years ago now. All right. So with all that said, and my understanding, too, is that there were some financial sector giveaways as well, or at least protections for financial interests. What can you tell us about that before we sort of step back and make a sort of broad assessment?
Yeah. So what I can say generally is there's plenty of the bad stuff that was in the original NAFTA that didn't get fixed. And that includes all kinds of limits on regulation for food safety, for all kinds of services, energy, financial services. There is one new bad thing for financial services, which is the right to transfer data freely, financial data, which there was an exception in the original NAFTA, so that's slightly worse. But frankly, it was already really bad. It's just slightly worse. And some of this bad stuff was left intact, but it's already there. I mean, the thing everyone needs to understand is the agreement on offer is not the template for a good progressive agreement. A good progressive agreement would have climate provisions, which this doesn't. It would have enforceable currency disciplines. It would have rules against monopoly. It would not have any constraints on the regulation of food safety or the environment or the big online giants or the service sector like energy or finance. That stuff is leftover garbage from NAFTA, and it's still there. They didn't put in the things missing. They didn't take out some of the bad stuff. So what we have here is a floor with no ISDS. It's mainly whack. There's still some bits of it. It's a problem, but with ISDS mainly whack, without the crazy pharma stuff, with stronger labor and environmental standards and enforcement, maybe not strong enough to make a difference. We'll have to see if it works. That's the floor from which we'll have to keep advocating for a stronger, better, real progressive agreement. But the mission is to try and stop some of NAFTA's ongoing damage. And so the political quandary, which I know is where you're going,
right,
is who makes that call. As much as we all despise Trump, if there is on offer the prospect of actually making a lot of people in the U.S. and Mexico's lives better, then what is that line where not wanting to do it during the Trump era means we should deny the prospect of having an agreement that's better than the old one go into effect?
Correct.
And that is, from my take, when the ISDS whacking happened, is when I started saying to myself, all right, now I need to see if they get the pharma garbage out and if they make real progress in environment and labor and enforcement, because then we do have something that actually, practically, could make people's lives better and could make enough of a difference that it's worth contemplating the importance of trying to stop some of the ongoing damage. Because as much as we aspire to a future Democratic progressive president and a Democratic Congress doing a really progressive trade agreement, we don't know what the future will hold politically. We don't know what the future will hold policy-wise. And if we have in front of us the chance to try and stop some of NAFTA's damage in a real way, then for me, I mean, I largely leave the politics to other people. The policy sort of moral imperative is you can either have the old NAFTA or you can have something that might fix the damage. When you get to the standard of you have something that might fix some of that damage, slow it down, then for me, the choice is you go for the fix, particularly with ISDS, because you're signaling to the whole world that they have the power to join, to take the U.S. cover, to join the exit of this corporate power scheme.
Okay,
but people with smarter political judgment.
Well, no, I understand. No, that's why I wanted you on. I wanted to get an assessment of just like how dramatic of an improvement would this be to warrant potentially Donald Trump being able to go through the 3 states that he won by less votes than show up at a at a really big rally or pretty close. With a picture of Richard Trumka and saying to these to people in these states where you do have a much higher density of union workers, probably somewhere around 25% of households, saying, look, I came through for you guys. And that, I mean, that's ultimately the question is something like this when you're talking about a marginal such a thin, razor thin, a chance of Donald Trump winning, or I should say winning by a razor thin margin. Is it ultimately worth this? What, in terms of timing, is there any type of clock ticking?
A clock ticking on the agreement?
No, a clock ticking on the renegotiated agreement. In other words, when Donald Trump signed it a year ago as a way of saying, like, okay, now we're going to go work it out, was there, this expires in 12 months, this expires in 24 months, if we don't get it done within 36 months? Is there any type of clock ticking? In other words, could these negotiations have gone on for another 5-10 months?
I think that no, there is no legal clock ticking is the answer. And I think that again, I leave the politics to other people,
right.
But I think that from some of the people I have heard talk about this, who I think are very smart politically, a lot of people thought politically it was a smarter move to have a vote on a revised NAFTA in the lame duck session after the 2020 election, so that Trump could not go around the country announcing he had achieved this. Now, on the other hand, I do want to say that he can run around saying he's renegotiated NAFTA, but the reality is we're losing manufacturing jobs. We're basically slipping into a recession in the manufacturing sector. So currently, there is an increase in layoffs in the manufacturing sector such that you can say, I've been a great success. He can claim that, he's fixed things. But if people's actual experiences, they have been laid off from manufacturing jobs, if the Democratic candidate's running around saying there are X hundred thousands of less manufacturing jobs, here's how much bigger the trade deficit is than it was at the start of the Trump administration. Here are all the things the president didn't deliver on trade.
Right.
I don't know how to judge what the impact of this agreement is.
Right. I mean, we have farmers who are being who have taken it, gotten smashed in the face by the Trump administration. There is no reason to believe that they're not supporting Trump as much as they were. My concern really is more the imagery. We live in an era now where if we were going to rely simply on economic news, and apply a standard formula to that, then Donald Trump will walk away with this election. And so, we're living in a different era now. And I guess let me ask you this: when it goes to the Senate, and certainly there has been some pushback by some of the Republicans in the Senate. My understanding is that Mitch McConnell is now planning to bring it up after the impeachment trial, presuming the articles of impeachment go to the Senate at the beginning of the year. So this is going to show up on the calendar in the Senate. Could be February, could be March, could be April, somewhere around there. Senate could easily just say, oh, we're going to pass our version of it, which is going to have that ISDS in it, right? And then they send it back to the House. Is that correct?
It can't happen that way because the way it works is the international agreement itself is signed between the three parties, and that's what determines whether there is, for instance, ISDS or the pharma giveaways. It's the actual agreement. What Congress votes on is what's called implementing legislation, and it basically, the first article says the United States Congress approves and enters into the international agreement called blah, blah, signed on blah, blah date. And so Congress's authority is only to implement or not implement the actual agreement. The agreement sets the terms. So yesterday, when the amendments to the agreement were signed, that's what's on offer.
So the amendments of the agreement who did the signing yesterday?
The governments of the United States, Mexico, and Canada.
Okay, so the agreement itself now has eliminated ISDS. So there's no way for the Senate to amend what the House has done. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, it's not that the House has done it. The actual international agreement signed between the three sovereign nations has in its terms, for instance, what used to be Chapter 11B of the NAFTA, that's Investor State Dispute Settlement, no longer is in the text.
Okay.
And instead, there is nothing between the U.S. and Canada, and there's a special annex with this new limited system with Mexico. And that was already in the 2018 text. Yesterday, they then signed pages of amendments to the 2018 text, which got rid of the pharma giveaways, et cetera.
So once those are signed, then the House turns around and says, okay, now we feel comfortable in essentially giving the green light for implementation of this.
That's the way it works. Congress's constitutional authority is to implement the agreements. The executive branch negotiates and enters into them. So in other words, the Senate,
when it goes to the Senate, it's an up or down vote.
It's an up or down vote in the Senate. Exactly. Now, the Senate could do there are all kinds of procedural anomalies that would be required, but the Senate could refuse to pick up the bill unless and until XYZ happened, but then they'd have to go back and negotiate some more.
Okay. So Mitch McConnell has an up or down vote essentially for all intents and purposes, and it doesn't go back to the House. I mean that at least alleviates a deep concern of mine, which is that once the House has gotten sort of pregnant with this idea of like we rolled them and then it comes back to them in a different form, that they wouldn't capitulate. But at least that's off the table. All right. Well, Lori, I appreciate this assessment of it. And so, people can make their own determinations as to whether from a political standpoint, if it's worth it. And it may be one of those things where, I'll tell you on November, whatever it is, 8th, 2020.
Oy.
Exactly. Well, Lori Wallach, Director of Public Citizens Global Trade Watch, really appreciate your time today.
Thank you very much.